Welcome, welcome, welcome to the ClairAudioFiles. This is a podcast where deep and thoughtful listening cuts through the noise and gets us to what really is the ultimate goal here, which is greater understanding. My name is Zara Shakti. I am your host and producer, and it is a pleasure to be here with you. Thank you very much for listening. I couldn't be more honored to have as my first guest and first episode on the podcast an interview with a woman who I so greatly admire and respect for her personal journey and also for the many things that she's accomplished in her life. Most of all, though, it's her attitude, her perception, and her understanding of both herself and the generous kind of respect and understanding and compassion that she so beautifully elucidates to the world around her, to the people who she's worked with, and to the many people who she will speak about on this podcast. I am talking about the legendary, the one and only Dr. Susan Rogers. Susan is a record engineer, recording engineer, a producer, an author, a professor. She holds a PhD in psychoacoustics and neuroscience. She's also a neuroscientist. And she is known very well among the music industry as the staff engineer for Prince during some of his most iconic years. She was the engineer who recorded with him Purple Rain, Parade, Around the World in a Day, the Black Album, Sign of the Times. She also went on to produce records for Prince, but also for a number of legendary musicians such as the Bare Naked Ladies, Tricky, David Byrne, and much, much more. She has an extremely compassionate and depth of understanding about human beings, about what motivates us, about why we are the way that we are, and why it is important for us to know ourselves. These were just some of the things that we talked about in this two-part interview, the first of which you're about to see or hear, depending on how you're listening. And there is so much in this interview that whether you are a music lover, a Prince fan, an engineer, a creative being or not, there's so much to learn from in here. Because like I said, Susan is one of those rare people that can so clearly, lovingly, caringly, and insightfully give us an example and some really interesting things to think about who we are, how we come into being, and why we love and do the things that we love and do. Without further ado, please enjoy this episode of the ClairAudioFiles with Dr. Susan Rogers.
I just want to say from the start, thank you so much for not only speaking to me, but speaking to everyone. It feels like who reaches out to you to talk about Prince. You're so generous and kind with your time. It's a great example to follow, I think, for all of us who come after this legacy of music and just all of us in general, right? It's a model to follow because you recognize what that contribution meant for you specifically and how it was part of such a greater collective. Like Prince is someone who has affected the both of us, albeit in extremely different ways, yet there's still that mutual connection, which is something very special.
Yeah, I'm so fortunate to have been in his company, to have spent that much time with him, to have been of service to him. I never lost sight of that every day when I was working for him, and since his passing, the whole time, it's the reason I like to contribute to the conversation of who the man was is because he was so complex and so unusual of an individual that any one person saying, oh, I knew him and he was like this, and that can't even begin to describe who this man was. So I think that what those of us who knew him, should do for his legacy, for history, for his fans, we should all talk about him. And the more of us who represent the different eras and the different facets of his life talk about him, the more of us who talk about him. That's my McGill training there. Make sure speak as you would write. But the more of us who talk about him, the more complete of a picture will emerge. And that's the best thing we can do for him, I think, is tell the truth, talk about who he was.
And even then, do you think that you would be able to piece together a complete picture of his life, his music, who he was?
It's a really good question, and I don't think I've been asked that question before, but it's a really good one, because what makes up a human being is so dependent on their motives and drives, what they want. It's dependent on their self-image. And we can look at their outer image and we can look at their outer actions and we can say, oh, I know what you want, or I know how you think about yourself, or I know who you are. We don't. I wish that Prince had been more forthcoming, especially in his youth, about giving interviews and things like that. Maybe we'd have a more complete picture. But ultimately, I believe he said it in an interview, he's the only one who knows himself. And that's true for all of us. We're the only ones who truly know ourselves. So we either go on the mic and we try to fill in those details, discussing who it is we want to be, what we'd like to have happen in this world. But if we don't, then those of us who are curious are going to have to be okay with recognizing it's going to have to remain a mystery. We'll never know Prince, truly know him. But that's okay. That's okay. We can make guesses, and it's fun to make guesses, and it ultimately doesn't matter how accurate or how closely we get to the absolute truth.
One of the things that really intrigues me with Prince, especially into his younger years, is that it seemed like he had a really strong sense of what his, for lack of a better word, what his value was as a creative being. Because when you look at how he really stood up for himself unapologetically as a 18-year-old, you know, which is already like, okay, with, standing up for himself and his creative freedom and his ownership. And, I can't imagine within his own personal relationships and putting his band together and putting a team, etc. It just fascinates me that inner knowing that I think we all ideally would have with regards to ourselves, but many of us, it takes a lifetime to figure that out. He had it at such a young age.
That's an interesting question. I think it concerns, metaphorically speaking, your sense of how much gas you've got in the tank. You're young, you're about to embark on this journey of life. And I firmly believe that children know who they are. Down deep inside, I think children know who they are. I felt like I did. It leads me to believe that Prince knew who he was. Now, there are people who are under the belief that they've got that full tank of gas and that they're going to be huge superstars in the music business. And then when it doesn't happen, they usually tend to blame outside forces. And they say, well, it's just because, I could have gotten there, but this didn't happen or that didn't happen. I've never seen that those excuses actually have any valid reason for holding up. So I think Prince was one of those people who knew he was holding, to use another metaphor, he knew he had a full tank of gas. He knew he had a powerful creative engine under the hood. He knew he had the self-discipline to get there. He knew that he had the focus. He knew that he was willing to make the sacrifices. And that knowing helped his decision-making when he was very, very young. He was able to say yes to every opportunity without looking back. Because I teach at Berklee College of Music and I teach young music business aspirants, people who want to be artists or producers in some capacity. I meet a lot of young people and I hear them talk about what they want, and I hear them do that analysis of what skills they believe they're holding, what talents, what they think they have to contribute. And not that many, not a very high percentage of them, I think, really understand where they fit in the hierarchy, or what their potential is, I should say. There are a few, and those are the ones who tend to do really well.
That's so. First of all, are you saying some have somewhat of an inflated idea of where they can go given
Some
who they are?
do,
Yeah.
yeah. And the ones who have an overly inflated idea of their abilities are the ones who will not. I mean, I just know from experience, 45 years in the music business, they're not going to go far.
Mm.
There are others who have the opposite. They don't have enough confidence. They just don't have enough belief in their abilities, and they're not going to go far either because they're not going to be able to make the sacrifices and, shall I say, even have the courage to say yes to certain opportunities when they present themselves. And perhaps they just don't want it badly enough. But there are some in the middle who have the clear heads and know that, yeah, I might not have all the gas right now, but there's a filling station a year or two down the road. I'll pull off there and I'll refuel if I need to. In other words, they know I'm in this for the long haul, and let me just see how far I'm going to get. Prince was one, I believe, who knew he was in for the long haul and also knew he wouldn't have to pull off the road for fuel because he was carrying so much. Now, for me and for others like me who were mere mortals, unlike Prince, we got into the business and just had enough gas always in the tank to keep going and to make forward progress and to actually achieve things in the music business. But it is tough.
Do you think that, given your own experience in research and in teaching and in life and working as a record producer, where does talent fall on that scale as to determining how far you will go?
Yeah, the concept of talent is still being understood, at least by psychologists. We used to say things, pithy things like, oh, he was born with it. Oh, it's a natural gift. We now know that's not quite true, although there's some truth to it. We now know that talent is the product of a lot of cognitive and personality traits, plus circumstances. You have to be where your talent can be expressed. So talent involves the focus, the self-discipline to practice monomaniacally, which Prince had no problem doing. The stories are legendary about how much time he would spend practicing when he was young. I can attest firsthand at how much time he spent playing and practicing in rehearsal when I knew him in the 80s.
Yeah.
So there's these qualities of focus and self-discipline. It helps to have a high IQ, which he undoubtedly had. It helps to be smart. And it helps to be ambitious, because some people are greatly creative, but they don't have the ambition to hold it together and actually create things. So yeah, he had all of those features, and all of those things fall under the umbrella of what we label talent, but it's more than just one quality.
Okay, so while we're talking about this, you said something a couple minutes ago that you wish Prince had done more interviews when he was younger. I also know from listening to a lot of interviews that you've given, and it's corroborated over and over again, that Prince was actually a very shy, perhaps introverted person. I'm assuming introverted, but shy, I know. And that being so creative and his mind being so active with constant ideas and wanting to just constantly be in the studio and record and create, that somebody who's like that needs to have a certain protective force field around them in order for their creativity to be able to incubate as much as they need it to incubate.
Yeah.
And also maybe filter out certain outside influences that aren't coming from within.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think it requires I should say what it is. If you have hypercreativity and you have the wherewithal to be in the business and actually make things, then you almost have to set yourself up on a foreign planet. You have to set yourself up in a world that's different from the world that most people occupy. I have a friend named Tim who is a sculptor, and he's married to a wonderful woman. They've been together for 40 some odd years. And Tim says every artist needs someone to keep the world out of his or her way. That's certainly true of the artists that I know. I talked to Ed Robertson from Bare Naked Ladies the other day, and Ed was, I asked him some question about something, some quotidian detail of life, and he kind of laughed. He says, I don't know anything about that. My wife handles life. My wife handles all of that. So Prince was unmarried. So what's he going to do? Who's he going to have as a protector to keep the world out of his way? He was not the most trusting person. So it's not like he's going to let any one person, like his manager or his operations manager or a girlfriend or anything like that, handle a lot of these responsibilities. What he's going to do is handle them himself, but put up a very thick shield that will only allow certain questions to come to him and will only demand so much of him so that he can keep everything else for himself.
What were those things that he was managing? Because again, the world that he built was so vast, like within and of itself, musically, creatively, the live shows, the performances, you know, the acts, the jokes, the costumes, everything. It's so rich. Like even within his music, the trail of the ideas are evident within the music, like the same repetitive symbols or words, phrases, songs that reference other songs or stories that happened in another song, you know. Like the number 7 comes up a lot. Soul psychedelicide, you know. Like, how did this man who had so much within him, how is it humanly possible to also be what it seems like a very strong or savvy leader in terms of leading a team, leading a vision, yet also be able to create his own world and his own universes and then even reinvent them over and over again?
So hard for me to even imagine what it was like for him to be 24, 25, 26, 27 years old. I think in the years when I knew him, be incredibly wealthy, wealthier than anyone he had known prior to that personally. There were no rich people in his world. Have employees and yet be that artistically productive and creative and have personal relationships, have girlfriends and date and have some kind of a, however narrow, some kind of a social life. How he managed all that, I don't know. I said a moment ago that he wasn't that trusting of a person, and I think that's true. That's true of his nature. But he knew that in order to carry out his wishes and his demands, he needed to have people around him that he could trust. He knew that he needed to be able to tell you, I need this done, and then walk away and not repeat it, not follow up, trust that you'll get it done. So whether it was Alan Leeds handling his day-to-day operations at Paisley Park for many, many years, or Sal Greco, who was chief tech, or it was me, who was his engineer back in the 80s, whether it was his band members, whether it was the people who made clothes for him, or the folks who handled his money, or any of those executive decisions or executive functions, I should say. He made the decisions, but the functions were carried out. I think he was smart enough, one, to hire good people who would be loyal to him and would get the job done, and two, to know when to just tell them what to do and then step away. This is one of the greatest gifts he gave me, if not the greatest gift, is the empowerment and the responsibility to let me act for myself, to do the things that he needed done so that his work could continue to progress. A great confidence builder.
Can you give any examples of when you were feeling that actively with him? That, you know, Susan, I know you can handle this.
I don't know. He didn't even say, I know you can handle this. He assumed that you knew he knew. And that was
Right.
pretty much every day. So, for
Okay.
example, let me just give you an example. We could be working on a Sheila E. album or a Time album or even a Prince album, and we're working at Sunset Sound in Los Angeles, and day in and day out. And the phone could ring in the studio and pick up the phone. He's on the other end of the line, and he says, "We're going back to Minnesota." Click. And what that means is I pack up all the tapes. I get to Northwestern or Republic Airlines. Those are the ones we used in those days. I get air cargo to get these tapes back as fast as possible. I get myself out of the hotel and get packed up and get home as fast as possible. And by as fast as possible, I mean now. Pack it up now, get to the airport now.
Wow.
That's just kind of how it was. Or he might say something like, I don't know. He'll say, "Get me." Here's an example. Get me a Bosendorfer piano. I want a Bosendorfer. I was 2 years older than him. I don't know anything about Bosendorfer pianos, except that at that time in the 1980s, they were 70 grand.
Mm.
It's a big purchase.
Mm.
But it just means get it done. Well, ultimately, he decided against spending that much money on a Bosendorfer. He stuck with his Yamaha. But the stories are so long, from Robbie Pastor and Sal Greco and Alan Leeds and his band members and myself, of just him just saying, "Get this done." And sometimes you'd hesitate and you'd say, "Well, I can do that, but it's going to be really expensive." And he'd always say, "What am I, broke?" He didn't care. Or you'd say, "Well, it's going to take, a day or two." He didn't
Yeah.
want to hear it. He
Yeah.
got that information out of him. It belongs to you now.
Mm-hmm.
You deal with it.
Oh. So, okay, before I forget this point, I just want to ask, just want to clarify too about that trust and that picking of people. So I had initially, because I got that sense just from knowing how many people he was bringing into the studio, that he seemed to be very like quick and decisive with things, just make a decision on the fly, such as I need this piano, Susan, get me this piano, or whatever. So I always kind of, I wondered about that. And I thought maybe it was part of his spirit that was so, like the kind of people who are just like, they don't see barriers towards something. They just see it as it's possible. Why can't I? So same thing with trusting people. Like, why can't, why can't this person play on my record, or why can't this person be part of the team? Right? No, you're here. All right, can you do this? I always thought it was just like an automatic trust that he gave to people, or an automatic, I have confidence in you. But was it more discerned than that?
It was more discerning. He wasn't. I could tell from the staff, folks that we hired, especially the technical crew, the road crew, who would come and go, and there were some that he trusted from the drop, right from the beginning. Most of them he didn't, and he wouldn't even talk to them directly. He'd give his orders to other people. The qualities that certain people had that fostered his trust was a certain kind of meekness and humility. You had to definitely make it clear by your mannerisms and your speech that you recognized he was the boss. As he once even said to a group of us, we were at the warehouse and we were standing around talking, and we're talking about one of the road crews who was a real asshole. And anyway, Prince just happened to walk into rehearsal, and he walked up to us and we were talking. So as soon as he walked up, we all just got really quiet, and he just says, "Who's an asshole?" We're all really quiet. Nobody wanted to rat anyone out. And he says, "Let me make this clear. There's only one asshole around here, and it's me."
Wow.
So, he was perfectly clear. What that was, you had to be humble enough to let him lead. You had to be trusting enough to believe that he had his hand on the tiller and that this was going to be okay. You did have to be pretty bright You had to share some of his qualities. You had to be tenacious and hardworking. You had to have some ambition yourself. You had to have that pride in your work. Pride. Like, no, this the motto that lasted me my whole career, my personal motto was no job's too big, no job's too small. I'll do the smallest thing you ask me to do. I'll do the biggest thing you ask me to do. It's a matter of pride for yourself. You just want to do it. And when he recognized that people, certain people had those qualities, those were the ones he put in a position of responsibility.
Okay. So kind of turning just into a little bit of a different direction, although on that note of working with him, you've said a number of times that Prince liked working with women. And maybe just for those who will be watching this, can you explain a little bit of why do you feel that was? And prior to, and if you knew that prior to working with him, how did you know that?
Oh, I didn't know that for a fact prior to working with him. There were women in his band, so I suspected as much.
Okay.
He hired me, so that gave me a hint that he wasn't averse to having a woman be his audio technician. He was open to that. So,
can I just pause you for a second there, Susan? Was that an anomaly in that time? Were people averse to having female audio technicians? Yeah,
it's an anomaly today. Today.
That's true.
A big report just came out, the Fix the Mix report, just came out in April, and it's by an organization that I serve on the board of called We Are Moving the Needle, and it's women in technical positions in record making, engineers, producers, mixers, and this report shows the percentage of women in these positions hovers around 1%. And for many genres of music, it's at 0%. So this is in the year 2023. So yeah, it was to have a female technician. There weren't many of us in the world, for one thing, and for another, for a guy to just turn his studio over to a woman. No questions asked. It's rare. As I said before, Prince was smarter than the
That's right.
guy. So there's one of those reasons there. And of course, all the men who hired me and trusted me with their records, including Bare Naked Ladies and Gaggy Taw and Robin Ford and Tricky, and anybody who said, yeah, we want you. Yeah, it was, I didn't know what to expect when I went to work for him. I knew that I was a fan. I had all his albums. I had seen him live when he played Los Angeles Dirty Mind tour and 1999 tour. I was such a huge fan. And that worked out really well for him. He liked working with women, I think, for a number of reasons. One is that men are less likely, or rather women are less likely than men to challenge his authority. I saw how, not the members of the revolution, but I definitely saw how members of the time had egos, and they had talent, and they had brains, and so it was natural for these young men to push back against him, and it caused a strain for him mentally. It was difficult. I saw some of that. That was difficult. Women were less likely to push that way. Women tend to be a little bit more understanding of a collective, of an us. And boy, did he need that in his employees. He needed his employees to just be an us, be an entity that kept the train of his creativity going at the speeds that it went. He was the engine, he was the driver, he was handling all the responsibilities, but we were the one fueling the coal into that engine. And he liked that about women. We're okay. We're a little bit better with an idea of an us. That's been shown. And the third thing is, boy, he had a soft spot in his heart for people who were outliers. for people who were odd and didn't quite fit the bill, someone you wouldn't expect would serve that role. This is why he had Wendy and Lisa in his band, and why I think he was proud to have me as his technician, and Peggy McCreary out in Los Angeles. He liked working with her because I think he had a little bit of pride that he was giving some outliers opportunities.
Okay. So when it came to working with him as a woman, what were some of those particularities?
Well, you ask such good questions, and questions I haven't been asked before.
Thank you.
I'll be really candid with you. He, like some, not all, but some of the other men that I've worked with as well, was very charismatic and very good looking and very attractive. And I'm a heterosexual woman who was a young woman in those days, who never had a damn day off or a date or anything. So being at his side day in and day out required a good deal of certain kind of suppression on my part to not cross any kind of line that would make things uncomfortable. It required a mindset that kept me at my job and kept me serving his engineering needs. And I was pretty good about that. I've got the mental toughness that allowed me to stay right there in that cage and do my job and not attempt to do anything else. So I never attempted to be his friend, or God forbid, I never, that would have been laughable, but God forbid, I never flirted or did anything like that to draw attention to myself in that way. I'm just that kind of woman who could do that. It might have been much more difficult for another woman, but I was able to do that. So there was a challenge there, but it was a challenge I could meet.
Oof. Yeah, I can only imagine.
Yeah, can you imagine? I mean, have you ever had the experience? This happened to me 2 or 3 times in my life. Have you ever been in the room with a model, male or female model?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. You just
Yeah. There's something a little bit off-putting about being with someone who is exceptionally good looking. I had the great privilege in the late 1980s to spend an afternoon recording Charlie Sexton. Do you know of Charlie Sexton?
yeah.
Pictures of Charlie Sexton in the 80s. That was the guy who was standing right next to me for hours. And he was funny and smart and talented and great. So there are these rare birds that you will in the music business encounter. And sometimes you'll spend a lot of time with them. Prince was one of the rarest of rare birds, and I spent countless hours with the man over a period of years. So yeah, there was a challenge there, but I figured it out. I did the mental equation early in my time with him, solved the equation, and never needed to look at it again.
Mm. Did it get easier over time?
No.
Oh, wow.
No, he was Prince.
Yes.
I mean, he was
Probably
always
got harder.
Yeah, he was always impeccably dressed and perfectly groomed, and he always smelled good. And he had makeup on, and his skincare. I don't mean like pancake makeup. I mean just a little bit, but a little bit of eye makeup. But his skin was always just glowing. And yeah, this was one of those rare birds. And that's why I brought up the example of being in the room with a model, where you realize this person is not like me and my friends. This person is not like any members of my family. This person is not like people that I know. And so I guess you behave differently around them.
Okay. So, This is a big question, or maybe it's not. To me, it's a big question. What was his aura like?
It was pretty great. Another good question. Confidence, command. I don't know people in the military, but I imagine if you're in the military and a general walks in the room,
Mm.
the general has an aura and you know it, and everyone is at attention and all eyes are on this person. So your eyes weren't on him because he was rich and famous. I've been in the room with rich and famous people that I honestly couldn't care less about. It's not that. It was his command and his confidence of that room. But now bear in mind, when I was in a room with him, it was either a recording studio or it was rehearsal. Sometimes it'd be a movie set, but we were always working. That was my role. And he was always the boss. Other people who maybe dated him or were in his band, they might say something different. But in my case, every time he came in the room, you know, he wasn't a very tall fellow, but that hair was up there kind of high, and he always wore the high-heeled boots. And then there was this aura around him that you perceived to be massive. He filled up the room. He was the brightest light in the room.
Mm-hmm.
And you get right away, you get a sense of how smart he is, what a keen observer he is. You could read his mood right away. When he was in good mood, and when he was in a bad mood, he walked slightly differently. And eye contact would be slightly different when he was in a bad mood. He'd kind of avoid eye contact a little bit. When he was in a good mood, he'd look right at you and read your face. But when he was in a bad mood, he wanted to be in his own head. And one of the things I admire about him, he wasn't one of those rock stars who threw temper tantrums or threw things or lashed out. He could be, you know, he could get mad, but he wasn't a temper tantrum guy. So most of the time when he was in a bad mood, he just got quiet. It was kind of chilling, and he wouldn't want to make eye contact. So you just know he's in his private head right now, and you would just match him. You'd be quiet. You'd serve whatever his needs were, which in my case was always routing signal to and from, being extremely attentive to him, watching for his commands, which would often be just abrupt and terse. That's when he was in a bad mood, or when he had a lot on his mind. When he was in a good mood, he was he was very quick to make a joke and very funny and jovial. And I've said this in interviews before, but he was a tease, like juvenile kind of tease. He'd make fun of something you're wearing or something you said or whatever, you know, almost like a little kid who was kind of a pest. But that meant he was in a good mood. But that mood could turn if you got a phone call or if something happened. That mood could turn. So yeah, that's who he was, and I wouldn't have expected him to be any different. I've worked with some famous people, and some people who are on their way to fame, but none of them were quite like that.
I'm thinking of a session, and it was a recording of a song that he had you erase. So I think you know what I'm talking about. So I'm thinking of that story because I'm curious about. I mean, I can just hear it in his music, how he really put things and expressed things in his life and himself into the music. Like he is his music. So, you know, whether it's that Wally story, which I would love for you to share, and or maybe another one regarding, you know, maybe a song that probably none of us would know has that kind of a energy going into it during the recording.
You know, that's a good question. I wish I could remember specific songs that we recorded when he was in a dark mood. I guess the only one that I can say with confidence was, ironically, Housequake. So yeah, he put himself into his music, but he didn't necessarily put his current self into his music. So, you know what? Let me give a quick professorial sidebar, and then I'll come back and I will tell the story about Wally. But there was a scholar, philosopher and scholar in the late 18th century named Friedrich Schiller, and he talked about naive art versus sentimental. And when we all start out, we are naive artists, whether we're doing cave paintings or whether we're little kids making music by banging on pots and pans. We don't have any training at all. We're just trying to express ourselves naively. Then, if you're musically inclined, you get yourself music lessons and you work your way from naivety to being sentimental. And sentimental means not that you're maudlin or sappy. It means you can express any human emotion, any sentiment, through sheer knowledge and skill alone. So Beethoven could write angry music without being angry. Prince could do really happy, joyful music while not feeling it, because he was his craft was so advanced and he was so virtuoso on so many instruments. He knew how happy songs go. If you continuing on my sidebar, if you watch the concert film Sign of the Times, have you seen that? Yeah.
Oh yeah.
And they're on stage and they're doing Play in the Sunshine.
Mm-hmm.
He was not happy. That whole show. I remember that time really well, and those shows and the weeks immediately afterward when we did post-production back at home, it wasn't a happy time in his life. And yet he's doing Play in the Sunshine and this happy, arousing music. And you realize that happy, arousing music is not tethered to anything that's personally going on with him right now. It's his craft. He's a master craftsman. So now to tell you the story about Wally, it took place in December in Minnesota at his home. He had a home studio before Paisley Park Studios was up and running. This would have been December of '86. He had this beautiful home studio, and he had just ended his engagement to Susanna Melvoin. One of the reasons why the song Housequake was so unhappy was he had just ended a relationship with the Revolution. Wendy and Lisa and Bobby Z had just left. So yeah, it was rough. So anyway, it wasn't long after that he broke it off with Susanna once and for all. And it was a Sunday. I seem to remember it was a Sunday. And he called me to the house, and it was just the two of us. And he either left me a note or he told me what he wanted, but he wanted his acoustic piano mic, and he wanted acoustic drums and, bass, of course, and some other instruments, and his vocal mic. And systematically, one instrument at a time, we went through and we recorded the song that I had been waiting to hear ever since that breakup with Susanna. And that song was Wally. And it was sad, it was heart-wrenching, it was personal. He's expressing his vulnerability. I thought it was one of the most honest things I had ever heard him do. And it was, on top of that, it was beautiful. And I'm a Prince fan, so I was especially excited for people to hear this record, because I was thinking, at last, he's finally stopped doing some of these happy dance songs, and he's finally doing the song that I knew was coming, which is, oh, this hurts, that kind of song. Finally, this is great. And, a session like that would take you the whole day. So I remember it was early. The sun was just coming up, which in December in Minnesota would have been about 8 o'clock in the morning. The sun was just coming up. Just finished, and he had me put a rough mix of it on cassette. And then he said to me, okay, now erase it. And those words were just chilling. I didn't know what he meant. He meant and I asked him, what do you mean? And I remember him saying, put all 24 tracks in record and erase it. And I remember shaking my head and just saying, no, don't do it. And I do remember saying, I think you should sleep on it. Pardon me, saying, you go upstairs and sleep, and if you still want me to do it, I'll come back to the studio and I'll erase it, but I think you should think about this. And he said, if you don't, I will. And I said, I just don't think I don't think it's a very good idea. And I remember the remote for the tape machine was in between us, And I remember him reaching his arm over the remote and arming the tracks, putting all 24 tracks in record mode. He wasn't kidding.
Yeah.
And he erased it top to bottom and took that cassette. Well, a few days later, we did re-record that song. Same melody, same chord changes, same lyrics, totally different attitude. So on the original Wally, he was expressing vulnerability and pain. On the remade Wally, he was expressing confidence, braggadocio. Yeah, yeah, she's gone, but yeah, I'll find another one. It's her loss, not mine. It wasn't the same attitude. It wasn't the honesty that had been there on the original Wally.
That's because and it's called Wally, correct? And he's saying, where'd you get those glasses?
Yeah, Wally Stafford, the late Wally Stafford, he just passed away last year. Wally was a bodyguard and also served as a dancer on stage. Wally and Greg Brooks and Jerome Benton, the three of them. So Wally was a guy who looked out for him, and Prince wrote this song, and it opens with speech. He's pretending he's having a conversation with Wally. He says, "Wally, where'd you get those glasses? Can I try them on? Because I'm going to a party tonight and I want to look so clean." And the music is playing underneath the background. And he says, still speaking, he says, "Yeah, Wally, do you have a sister?" Something like that. "Do you have a sister, and is she still fine?" "Yeah, see, the woman I was with, we broke up. And I want to meet somebody new." And then he goes into the song. So yeah, it was vulnerable initially, and when it was redone, it was no longer vulnerable. And I can't bear to listen to the new version of Wally, because I think that was the wrong move. It was the right move for him personally. It's what he wanted to do. He didn't want others to hear him be vulnerable. He just didn't like sharing that part of himself. So he liked the song, but he wasn't willing to use that treatment for public release.
So why do you think he didn't just put it in did the vault exist at this point? Because I know that you started the vault.
Yeah, it was being built. Well, the vault at Paisley Park was being built in December of 1986. So it was coming online. All of his tapes were stored in a vault, a type of vault, at a secure record storage facility in Minneapolis.
So why do you think he didn't just shelve that track? Like, did it mean something to him to have it to express it and then have it not in existence anymore?
I think so. I think he really didn't want anyone to hear it. And this is why I feel confident to this day saying that I think he'd approve of the posthumous releases that are coming out of the vault, because I know damn good and well firsthand, if he didn't want you to hear it, he would have destroyed it. He was proud of the work that he did. He was proud. It might not be ready for public consumption to his ear, but he was proud of it. And this was something, I can't say that the original Wally was something he wasn't proud of. It was just something he didn't want to share. And he ensured that it wouldn't be shared by erasing it.
Yeah, there's a weight that I'm feeling to this story after you told his craft. And beyond his craft, I think music and Prince, like Prince was music, as far as I'm concerned. So in a sense, it's the same way that when it was his way of dealing with the grief, because he's so intimately tied with creating music,
Yeah. And we, members of the public, tend to think of our artists as people who, well, we don't think about them as agents of their own, of the curation of their own art. In other words, we think that everything they do, as long as they've decided to be an artist and make some of their works public, that we think we have a right to enjoy all of the works that they've made. It's the precedent is set. When I was in Spain last week, I went to the Picasso Museum, and I saw all these sketches that Pablo Picasso donated to the museum in 1970. But these sketches spanned the time from when he was really young to later in his life. He made the conscious decision to let everyone see his demos and his quick little one-offs. He decided, I'm going to share this with you. Every artist has the right to decide what they're going to share because they have the right to determine what their public image is. And their public image is based on the works that they officially release. Bootlegs are so incredibly frustrating for many, many artists. They certainly were for Prince, because it's people deciding, no, I'm going to take this private thing from you. You know, I had this, metaphorically speaking, I happen to have a spy camera on you, and I happen to capture what you were doing in the privacy of your bedroom or the privacy of your home. And now I'm going to share it with everybody because, you know, you're a public figure and I have the right to share this with everybody. It's very, very invasive, and I think it's very immoral. But there are two sorts of conversations to have around that. One is the conversation when the artist is alive and still making work and still controlling his or her own public image. No one else has control over that. It's theirs, it belongs to them. But after they pass, then the question becomes, who controls their public image now that they're not here to speak for themselves? It's a question I've thought a lot about since he passed away. And my belief is that it should be all of us who knew him, like a pyramid, like those of us who knew him the best and for the longest should have the loudest voice in the room. But it should not be up to people who didn't know him to decide who he was.
Mm-hmm. All right. This has been an incredible episode of the ClairAudioFiles, Part 1 with Susan Rogers. Make sure that you subscribe to this podcast to get the next episode and next episodes that we put out. Part 2 of this particular interview is so fun, so fascinating. If you like this one, you're in for a real treat for the second one. As always, share the podcast, come back and watch it, listen to it again. And if you have any comments, questions, or suggestions on who we should interview next, please send me a note at my email or on the podcast Instagram, which is zara.shakti. And yeah, see you soon.